All right, so we'll say good morning, Aschos, Baruch Hashem, to be able to begin the day. Learning mitzvos Basra. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning share, to thank our TALMUD Torah sponsor for the month of Elul, Baruch Rena Dubin, in honor of our children, all of the Suburban sons and daughters beginning their year of studying Eretz Yisroel. May their Torah study and mitzvos in the Holy Land merit the release of our precious hostages, the success of our soldiers and return to their families, and the arrival of Moshiach, tzidkeuni, bimheira, amen. Also with that, let us begin. We have a really exciting daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Pei Gimel 83, and we are picking up in Eretz Hashem on Pei Beis Beis 82b, and I believe we left off with the Kama Yehe Beinehem. Is that correct? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 lines up from the bottom, right? Last narrow line? Okay, fine. Let's begin anyway from where I just said. Come here, right? Let's say, because the truth is right. You're right. Thank you. If we actually got to this, how much space does there have to be between the trees? So let's just go over the respective opinions again, and then jump right into this. So come here, Supposed to remember again. We're focusing just. The good news is same topic. 2 trees versus 3 trees. Now we're in the 3 tree topics. Remember again, 2 trees. What are you getting when you buy 2 trees? What do you get when you buy 2 trees? Trees. That's all you get, right? You buy 3 trees. What do you get? Trees and land. How much land? So remember again, we've established that in yesterday's daf. The land underneath the trees, the land between the trees, and halacha l'maisa, a little arc, a little surrounding area on the external part of the trees, wide enough in order for someone to walk around with a basket and be able to pick the fruit. Who seeds that external area? Who seeds it? Halacha l'maisa, no one. No one. That we established in yesterday's daf. Now, both say we get to the interesting question of, we know that obviously there has to be a certain amount of proximity between the 3 trees, right? Obviously, everyone's going to agree that if I buy 1 tree from Reuben over here, another tree a mile away, another tree 5 miles away, that doesn't create a contiguous area. So, halacha l'maisa, now the question becomes, is how much space? What is the maximum and minimum amount of space between the trees in order to be able to acquire the trees and the land in between? So here we go. So v'kami yehe b'nei, and how much space does it have to be between them? Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Shmuel, me'arba amos li'ad shmona. So we'll say this is Rabbi Yosef. So Rabbi Yosef's opinion is minimum of 4 amma of space and maximum of 8 amos. So remember again, the minimum is important. Why? We spoke about this yesterday. If you plant the trees too close to each other, then what is that considered? Remember from yesterday? A forest. Excellent. A forest is just looked at as a gathering of trees that are ready to be felled, that are ready to be harvested, ready to be cut down. So therefore, you need a minimum amount of space, and a maximum. So Rabbi Yosef says the minimum is there has to be at least 4 amas of space in between each tree, with a maximum of 8 amas of space between the trees. Okay, Rava Amar Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel Mishmor about Sheishes. Rava, in the name of Rav Nachman, a minimum of 8, maximum of 16. Okay, so here we go. Similarly, by the Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi says Rabbi Yosef lo tiflog aleid Rav Nachman. So Rabbi says Rabbi Yosef, why are you arguing on Rav Nachman? Disnan mas nisan kavasei, because there is a Mishnah that supports Rav Nachman. Remember Rav Nachman's position: minimum of 8, maximum of 16. What's the Mishnah that supports him? Here we go. Disnan hanotea es karmo sheishasrei amo mutter lahavi zar l'sham. So we'll say, so now, different topic. If you look at the Rashbam, Hanotea Karmo al Tez Zayin Amo, the Rashbam is about 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, about 12 lines up from the bottom. This is actually a very interesting Rashbam. Hanotea Karmo al Tez Zayin Amo. Shim Kola Kerem Natua. So just to give you the context over here, we're talking about a vineyard. And remember again, there's an issue in a vineyard called Kloi HaKerem, which is that halacha l'maisa, you can't plant other items within a vineyard, as it could potentially create forbidden mixtures. So now that's our topic over here. Well, not a topic. That's the commercial over here. So right, look at the Rashbam. Shimkala karam natua shuros. Let's say you have a vineyard that is planted rows. In rows, zu b'tzad zu, rechokos zu mizu tes zayin ama shlemos, lo b'tzarfin mehave kerem, deshur b'fnei atzma ena kerem. Now we'll say, there is a minimum definition of a vineyard. The minimum definition of a vineyard, as we're going to see, you have to have a certain amount of rows in close proximity to each other. So let me just say this outside for just a moment. If you have one row of a vineyard, and then another row 16 amos away, those two rows do not combine together to form a vineyard. Okay? The Rashon goes on, he says, so just by the way, just the minimum definition of a vineyard is really going to be 4 parallel rows with another 5th row on top. But the idea is they have to have proximity. So now what the Mishnah is pointing out over here is that if you have multiple rows of vines, but they are 16 amos away from each other, they do not combine. Whose opinion is that, Rabbi Osai? Whose opinion? That's Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman said the trees have to be a minimum of 8 amos, right? But a maximum of 16 amos. More than 16 amos, they're not connected. The Mishnah supports that idea. You have rows of a vineyard, and the rows are more than 16 amos apart. They do not combine to form a vineyard. They do not combine to form a vineyard. So he goes on to the point, by the way. So back to the Gemara. Back to the Gemara. Hanotea is first wide line. Hanotea is kamo sheish amo sheish amo motala havi zera l'sham. To the point, I will say that you would be allowed to plant other species in between those rows of the vineyard. Why? Because the rows do not come together to form a comprehensive vineyard. Incredible. I'm Rabbi Yehuda. Ma'aseh Salmon be'echad shenates kamo sheish amo. So, and now Rabbi Yehuda says there was a story. There was a story like this. There was a guy in Salmon. Salmon was the name of the place. And he had a vineyard. He had a vineyard where the rows were planted 16 amos apart. And what he would do was as follows. V'hayehofech sha'ar shtei shuros l'tzad echad v'zorea es hanir. L'shana acheres hayehofech es ashar l'makom hazera v'zora es habur. So what he used to do was as follows. He had all of these rows that were 16 amos apart. And certain years he would bend the vines into each other, right? The two rows like facing each other. And then he would go ahead and plant the area next to it. And he would alternate, right? Turning the rows next to each other. Now, by the way, the turning of the rows makes absolutely no difference. He's just telling us what he did. So in other words, one year he would plant one area between the vines and leave the other area fallow. The next year he would plant the fallow area, leave the next area fallow. The idea over here is what was happening. He had vines that were 16 amos apart. And what was he doing? He was planting something else in between them. Isn't that klaya karam? Isn't that forbidden mixtures in a vineyard? And the answer is no. Why? Because the vines were 16 amos apart. So you see over here that something that the items that are 16 amos apart do not combine together. This is a support for the position of Rav Nachman that again, in order for trees to be able to go ahead and have proximity to form a unit so as to acquire land, they have to be a minimum of 8 amos apart, but a maximum of 16. 16 or more, by definition, leaves them as separate and distinct items that do not combine. So the Gemara says, this guy who was doing this thing with his vines, v'tiru, and the rabbi said, shkoyach. I don't know if they said shkoyach, but they said, okay. Right? They said it's mutter. Okay. Obviously, I will say, one would think that doing something like this is probably not the best idea, right? Unless, of course, the vines are maybe even a little bit more spread apart, because the difference between 16 amos and 15 amos is not really all that much. And again, what makes the difference between something that's mutter versus also? But okay, point is they allowed it. Amalei, analo yadana ela uvdava. So he said, so listen to this. So Rav Yosef said, the truth is, I don't know about that. But I'll tell you a different story. Ela uvda hava, there was another story. There was another episode. Ultimately, again, top of Pegimel, Bedura Durausa. In the literally again in the village of shepherds. The Rashbam says Be'ir Shal Roim. V'asal coming to Rav Yehuda. Supposed to say, so first I'll take a look at the Rashbam. So Rashbam comments over here, Bedura Durausa. Be'ir Shal Roim, there was in this village of shepherds. Look at the Rasham. He tells us the story. Shemachar echad lechavera shlosh ilanos v'lo haya ches amos beinehen. Ultimately, again, there says this is the story that happened in the village. So Reuven sold Shimon 3 trees, and there was not 8 amos in between the trees. Now watch this. Now let's go back to the Gemara. So there was a story in this village of shepherds. Reuven sold Shimon 3 trees, and what happened? He came before Rav Yehuda. Now both say, now there was not 8 amos in between these trees. Okay, so now remember again, 8 amos represents the minimum amount of space that you need according to Rav Nachman. So now these three trees were sold. There wasn't 8 amos of space. The case came before Rav Yehuda, and Rav Yehuda said to the seller, "Va'amalei zil havle kimale bakar v'kelev." Go give the purchaser the amount of land corresponding to the amount that a cow and its utensils carry. And no one had any idea what is that amount. Like what does that represent? But after we learned the following, a person should not plant a tree next to the field of his friend, unless, of course, there is at least a space of Dalet Amos, right? You shouldn't go ahead and plant a tree next to your friend's field unless there's at least a space of Dalet Amos. V'tani Allah, and they said about those Dalet Amos, V'tani Allah, Dalet Amos sha'amru kedei avodas hakerem. That's enough space to work the field, to work the vineyard, to allow the cow or the ox with its utensils to go through. What do you see from here? The Gemara says, Amina, Shmamina, Kimali Bakar Vekelev Dalet Amos. What do you see from here? That's what? That the amount of space for a cow with its utensils to go by is Dalet Amos. So we'll say, so Ukarav Yosef. So we'll say, so what happened in that story? So in this story over here, watch what occurred. Reuven sold to Shimon 3 trees. The trees were less than 8 amos spaced apart. The seller did not give the buyer any land. The case came before Rav Yehuda, and essentially Rav Yehuda said, you're obligated to go ahead and give the buyer Dalet Amos of land. Who does that story support? That story supports Rav Yosef, who says that the minimum amount of space between the trees is Dalet Amos, and the maximum is 8. Okay, so we'll say, interestingly enough, what you see over here is we have 2. On one hand, Rav Nachman has a Mishnah and a story to support him, and Rav Yosef has a story. Okay. So the Gemara says, Rav Yosef Nilotanan, but don't we have a Mishnah that supports Rav Yosef as well? In other words, it's not just the story that backs up Rav Yosef, but it's a Mishnah as well. After all, we learned Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Shimon Omrim, Hanotea eskarmo shmona amos al shmona mutter lahavi zera l'sham. So listen, now watch this. This is actually a dramatic Mishnah. Now what's the halacha? If a person goes ahead and plants his vineyard, and he spaces the vines by 8 amos, you could plant other items in between those vines. So we'll say, what is that showing you? That when something is spaced 8 amos from something else, it's not connected. It's not connected to it. That supports the position of Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef holds that for the trees, the minimum is Dalet Amos, but the maximum is going to be 8 amos. To which the Gemara says, Afilu hachi, the Gemara says, Maisa adiv. The Gemara says, you're right, but here's the difference, is that Rav Nachman has the Mishnah, but he also has that great story from Salmon. Okay, so the Mishnah plus the story makes his position a little bit stronger. Fine, so let's analyze. So I will say, so bottom line is, we're still left with our fundamental machlokes, right? We have Rav Yosef. Now, everybody's giving the minimum and the maximum. So Rav Yosef is giving me my minimum of Dalet Amos, my maximum of 8 amos, and Rav Nachman is giving me my minimum of 8 amos, maximum of 16 amos. So Bishlan, Rav Yosef, Ali with Rabbi Shimon, Shamin Ale Mifuzar, Shamin Ale Rusufin. So it says, interestingly enough, so according to Rav Yosef, or Rav Yosef's opinion, according to Rabbi Shimon, we have both the shear for what we call mefuzarin and ritzufin. Mefuzarin means ultimately, again, how distant they could be, and also minimally how close they could be. Right? So remember again, Rav Yosef is the maximum amount of distance is 8 amos. The minimum amount of distance is Dalet Amos. Fine. Mefuzar hada amran. So again, mefuzar we spoke about again, maximum of 8 amos. Ritzufin, from where does he learn the minimum space? Right? How does he know that the trees have to have a minimum space of Dalet Amos? Tisnan, kerem hanatua apachos mi Dalet Amos eno kerem divrei Rabbi Shimon. If you have a vineyard that is planted and the vines are less than Dalet Amos away, they're not a vineyard. It's very interesting, this idea, as we see all these halachas by a vineyard, and it makes sense because a vineyard has to be structured in a certain way. So if the vines are too close to each other, It's not a vineyard. It's not a vineyard. What is it? It's a collection of vines. I don't know if you'd call it a forest by vines, but it's a collection of vines. Just a collection of vines. So Kerem to Apal Eno Kerem Divrei B'Shimon. V'Cham Nucham say no. Kerem V'Ronas Ha'im Soim Kila Einon. Cham say no. It is a vineyard, but we just view the middle vines as if they are not there. We view them as not being present, and therefore we only view the external vines as being there. So we'll say, but the point over here is, according to the first opinion, you see this supports Rabbi Yosef, that the minimum amount of distance necessary is going to be Dalar Amos. Ella, the Rav Nachman Ali b'd Rabbanan, but according to Rav Nachman, and according to the Rabbanan, Mifu Zarin Shamin and Lahu. So I know the maximum shear, right? The maximum shear of 16 amos. But from where do I know the minimum amount of distance of 8 amos? Ritzufin mishaminale, to which the Gemara says svarahu. It's logical. How is it logical? Bid Rabbi Shimon palga, Rabbanan nami palga. So I'll say, interestingly enough, the Gemara says it's logical. What's the logic? The logic seems to be that everything obviously is working in halves, right? That in other words, or double. In other words, that clearly the maximum is a double, is 2 times the minimum. That seems to be the way. So once according to Rav Nachman, you've established the minimum or the maximum as 16, then by definition you've established the minimum as 8. Okay. Amar Rava. So Rava says, Hilchasa. So we'll say, so what is the halacha? So remember again, we'll say, let's circle back. Why are we getting into all of this? What we need to know is as follows. Buying three trees entitles me to a lot more than just trees. But obviously, everyone is agreeing that the trees need to be within some level of proximity to each other. What is that proximity? Rav Yosef, minimum of Dalar Amos, maximum of 8 amos. Rav Nachman, minimum of 8, maximum of 16. So what is the halacha? Here it is. Amar Rava Hilchasa, me'arba amos v'ad sheshesve amos. Fascinating. So what does Rava do? He takes the floor and the ceiling, the maximum floor or the minimum floor, the maximum ceiling, and combines them together into a comprehensive shita. The trees must be at least Dalet amos away from each other, with a maximum of 16 amos away from each other. So the floor of Rav Yosef and the ceiling of Rav Nachman. Incredible. Tanya Kavase de Rava. There's a brayso that supports Rava. Kama yihu mikuravin. How close can the trees be to each other? Arba amos. 4 amos. The kama yihu meruchakin, and how distant can they be from each other? Sheishes rei 16 amos. So that, and as long as you have a minimum of 4 and a maximum of 16, hare ze kana karka ve'es ha'ilanos shebenehem. Then, so again, if the trees are a minimum of 4 amos from each other, with a maximum of 16 amos from each other, then you've acquired the trees. And I will say again, with everything we've spoken about, the land in between, the land underneath, and the circular arc, or I should say the pathway on the external part of the branches. Lefichach, now remember again, this is very important. What is the chap of acquiring land? In other words, when I acquire 3 trees and I acquire all of this land, so yes, of course, it's good to have land, but what else do I have? Lefichach, yavash ha'ilan o niktzatz yesh lo karka. So I'll say this is very important. Remember, the fundamental difference between acquiring just trees and acquiring trees with land is if the trees that I purchased dry up. If they dry up. So in other words, let's say again the trees die and they dry up. Do I have the right to plant new trees? So what does that depend on? If all I own is trees, then no, I own them for the life of the tree. Once the tree dies, we're done. If I own the land, then that gives me the ability to go ahead. Right, so if I own the land, then halacha lamaisa, then once I go ahead and once the tree dies, I have the ability to uproot it and plant something new in its stead. Incredible. So therefore, lefichach yava sha'ilan or niktzas yesh lo karka pachos mikan. But again, if the trees are spaced less than that, so let's say the trees are spaced less than 4 amos or more than 16. Lefichach, pachos mikan o yeser. Alkan, o shelachon bezeh achar zeh. So we'll say, there's a lot of stuff coming our way over here. So now, so let's take a step back. So halacha l'maisa, I go ahead and I purchase this tree. I purchased 3 trees. As long as there's a minimum of dalet amas and a maximum of 16, so I'm getting the trees, I'm getting the area underneath the trees, I'm getting the area between the trees, and I'm getting, again, the little path around the trees as well. And halacha l'maisa, if the trees die, I have the ability to plant something new there. But if I purchase trees, and they're either less than dalet amas from each other, or more than 16 amos from each other, or for that matter, listen to this next case. Shalachan b'zeh achar zeh. Very interesting. What happens if I go ahead and I purchase 3 trees, but I don't purchase them at once? I purchase them one after the other. So I say, I'm slowly buying up tree property. So the halacha is, the Gemara says, Hare ze lo kana, lo esa karka, v'lo esa ilano shebeneim. So Rabbi said, this is very interesting. This concept that when you buy 3 trees, you get the karka, that only occurs if what? If you're buying 3 trees at once. If you're buying trees consecutively, you do not acquire the land corresponding to the karka as well. Very interesting. V'lo esa ilanos shebeneim. You don't go ahead and get the trees in between. Therefore, lefichach, yavash ha'ilan o niktzatz. Therefore, if halacha l'maisa again, the tree dries up, or for that matter again, you cut it down. Ain't no karka. There is no karka. Incredible. All right, so we'll say that pretty much closes out this particular sugya. Next, so we'll say, so bottom line, halacha l'maisa. Now anything and everything you want to know about tree purchase, you now have. You are the full repository of all of this Talmudic information. So halacha l'maisa again, minimum of 4, maximum of 16. Interestingly enough, only applies if you're buying all the trees at once. But b'zeh achar zeh, you do not go ahead, even if it has the requisite spacing, you do not acquire all of the trees and that which is in between it. Beautiful. By Rabbi Yirmiyah. So Rabbi Yirmiyah asked the following shayla: Kishehu moded mimakom katzer hu moded, or mimakom rachav hu moded. So Rabbi said, this is a very interesting question. Now here's what's fascinating. So now I have to measure the trees, right? I have to measure the space. So we have a minimum of 4, minimum of dalet amas, maximum of 16. Where on the, this is fascinating, I don't know, I would have never thought that this is a question, but obviously it is a question. From where on the tree are you measuring? From where in the tree are you measuring? So listen to what the Gemara is asking over here. So kishu moded mimakom katzer hu moded, or mimakom rachav hu moded. So when you measure, are you measuring, again, from the, what we'll call the thin part of the tree, or from the thick part of the tree? Now, the assumption over here is that the trunk is widest at its base, and it gets progressively thinner. So when you're measuring the distance between trees, so we've established a minimum of 4 amos, a maximum of 16 amos. So when you're measuring, where am I measuring from? The base, or from somewhere on the thinner part, upper part of the tree? So the Gemara says, Amarli Rav Gavia mi Beik Sil Rav Ashi. So Rav Gavia of Beik Sil asked, so he said the following to Rav Ashi. He said, Tashma, let's analyze this. Nan, Harakuva Shebegefen, Eino Moded Ela Me'ikar Hasheni. So I will say, so remember again, this is not just a din in trees, as we've established, right? This is a din halacha l'maisa. This is a din halacha l'maisa by vines as well. Right, so in other words, in order to go ahead and have a vineyard, I also need a minimum amount of distance between the vines and a maximum amount of distance between the vines. So same thing with the vines. From where on the vines am I measuring? So the Gemara says as follows. So listen to this. Tashma disnan harakuva shebegefen. So I will say, if you have ultimately again, if you look at the Rashbam over here, harakuva shebegefen. Gefen bachor, markiven begefen zakin. So often what would happen is they would graft a young vine with a more mature vine. So when grafting, right, and then figuring out again how to measure to the other vines, eino modet ela me'ikar hasheni. So this is very interesting. Now vines have knots on them, right? This is like the bulge in the vine. So when measuring from one vine to the next, where do you measure from? You measure from the second knot. It's not from the bottom knot, but from the second knot. So as I look at the Rashbam, Ikar Sheni, Pekak Hasheni, the second knot, Kidisanya, Bekanim Ubegefanim Mina Pekak Ulamala. Avalo Mina Ikar Harishon, Sherach of Yoser, Valo Mina Shlishi, Shekatzer Harbe, Ela Mina Benoni, Vadin Li Ilana. So what says, so apparently, from the vine, there's like a lower knot, which is on a wider part of the vine, and there's an upper knot, which is on the thinnest part of the vine, and then there's the second knot, which is on like the middle part of the vine. So from where do you measure the vines? You measure them from the second knot, which is on the middle part of the vine. So the Gemara says, so too over here by trees you don't measure from the bottom wide base, and you don't measure from the upper thin part, but rather again you measure from the middle. Okay? Bar Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah has the following question. Machar lo shalosh bade ilan mahu. So Rabbi said, this is a very interesting case. What happens? Now look at the Rashban for just a moment, because I think he defines it better. Take a look at the second wide line in the Rashban. Gimel bade ilan. Ilan echad machar lo sheyish lo shalosh bade meruchakin zemizeh dalet amos vehe lo hakarka sirton venirin b'shas hamechira kishloshe ilanos. So mi azlinan basar guf ha'ilon dimine ka rabo ve'ilon karka odilma kevan dinishashu kol echad bekarka kana karka. So Rabbi said this is an interesting case. Imagine the following scenario: you have a tree. Now the tree has, if you could imagine, like 3 branches, but these branches are very much separated from each other. Over time, sediment gathered around the tree, to the point that now these 3 branches look like, and are essentially growing like 3 different trees. So now both say, and now they're being treated as 3 separate trees. So the Gemara says as follows, an interesting case over here. So the Gemara says, Shlosha bade ilan mahu. Amar le Rav Gvia. So both say, so what do you do with this? Do you look at this as 3 trees? Because since from above the ground level, they are essentially 3 trees, or do we look at it as 1 tree? Since underneath the soil, they are really looked at. They're really growing from one root. So Rav Gavia mebek sila Rav Ashi Tashma Disnan Hamavrich Gimel Gifanim V'ikrei Hanirin. So the Gemara says if you're grafting 3 vines, I will say now the way actually when they say grafting, they don't mean grafting in the typical sense of, let's say, grafting 2 things into each other. But what they used to do with vines was this. We've seen this many times throughout Shas. You would take a vine, right? And you would take the, so there's the part that grows in the ground and there's the part that grows up. You would take the part that grows up and you would plant it in the ground. So like an arc. Essentially then what would happen is the other side of the vine would take root in the ground. And then what you would do is you would cut it at the middle. So essentially 1 vine would effectively become 2. 1 vine would become 2. So the Gemara says, what's the halacha? Hamavrich gimel gifanim. So if you go ahead and you do this thing, you sort of quote unquote graft these 3 vines. Vikrehen nirin. Rabbi Lazar Tzadok Omer im yesh beinei midal amos vat shmona mitztarfin. If there is a minimum of 8 amos, 4 amos, a maximum of 8 amos, they combine. Ve'im lav ein mitztarfin. And if not, they don't combine. Okay. So we'll say, so what do you see over here? Look at the Rashbam. Midal amos varches amos Rabbi Meir Rabbi Shmuel Silber mitztarfin v'afal gav d'chol shtei gifanim yanki mishoresh echad. Now, in this interesting case, the halacha is, even though in this case initially you have quote unquote 2 vines that are really deriving nourishment from the same root. So what do you see from here? Even if you have multiple things deriving nourishment from the same root, if there is a distance, a minimum of 8 amos or 4 amos and a maximum of 8 amos, they are reckoned separately. So too these 3 trees, even though they are all deriving nourishment from the same root, halacha l'maisa, if they are minimally spaced, at least dalet amos, and maximally spaced 8 amos, ultimately they are considered like 3 distinct trees. Incredible. By Rav Papa. So Rav Papa asked the following. In some interesting cases over here. Machar lo shnayim b'soch sadehu v'echad al hametzar. So what happens in the following situation? I sell Ruvain 2 trees within my field and 1 on the border. Now both say, the Rashbam points this out over here. Remember, their borders were a little bit different. Border generally was raised, right? So that this is the border between fields. So you would have like a line of soil that was higher than the rest of the field. So now imagine the following scenario. I sell Ruvain 2 trees in my field and 1 on the border. So what's the shaila? Given that one of them is on the border, does that one on the border combine with the other ones? Doesn't go with the other ones. So Mao Shnaim, or another case, let's say I own 2 trees in my field, right? And Levi is my neighbor. And I own a tree in Levi's field with land surrounding that tree as well. And then I sell Ruvain 3 trees, 2 trees in my field, 1 tree in Levi's field, 1 tree in Levi's field. Now again, I own the land in Levi's field as well. But I sell all of this to Ruvain. Does that count as the purchase of 3 trees, and therefore doesn't come with all the corresponding land? To which the Gemara answers, Teku. Okay, we leave it. Leave it. Next. Amud Beis. Bar Ravashi. Bar Ma'u Shetafsik. So I will say, this is an interesting question. Let's say now I'm selling Ruvain a tree, or trees. And what happens? So I'm selling him 3 trees. And let's say Allah Chalamayis, again, as we spoke about, there's a minimum of Dalet Amos and a maximum of 16 Amos. But in this area, there's a bar, there's a pit, right? Ma'usha tafsik. So we'll say, so here's the shaila. Does the presence of a bar essentially disrupt the content or contiguity? Contiguity, right? That does it go ahead and disrupt the contiguousness of the space, right? Because remember, I'm going to say the whole chap over here is when you're buying 3 trees within close proximity to each other. And proximity now we've defined as a minimum of Dalet Amos, a maximum of 16 Amos. So that becomes a unit. So the shaila is: does the presence of a bar in this area disrupt the contiguousness of the area, or now, the assumption is that a bar has water in it. Okay, but maybe, you can't necessarily see the water from inside the bar. What if there's a stream? A stream runs through it. Does that disrupt the contiguousness? Rishus harabim mahu. What if there's mamash like a public thoroughfare that runs through it? Richva didikli. We'll say, what if there's a cluster of palm trees? So we'll say, so in other words, what we're asking over here is, we've always been assuming that I'm buying 3 trees, and I will say the space in between the trees is open. Now what the Gemara is essentially asking is, what happens if halacha l'maisa, there is something significant in that space? Does that disrupt the contiguousness of the area, and thereby preventing me from acquiring everything there? That's the shayla, which the Gemara says, Teku. Okay? Another reason to eagerly await the arrival of Moshiach and Eliyahu HaNavi to get the answers to all of these questions. Next. Hillel asked the following question of Rabbi. Interesting case over here. Allah erez benehen mahu. What happens if a cedar tree, so we'll say, so now this is actually a very interesting case. So what happens if a cedar tree pops up in this area, right? The cedar tree pops up. What occurs in that situation, right? Allah erez benehen mahu. So a cedar tree pops up in the middle. What's going to be the halacha? Mahu. Allah birshusa dideina. So what's the shaila? We'll say, if you have an area of this, right? So let's play this out. So again, halacha l'maisa, I'm selling Ruvain 3 trees, right? So there's 3 trees, assuming that the trees are at least Dalet Amos and a maximum of 16 Amos in between them. So then it becomes a contiguous area. So if there's a cedar tree in between, so I understand. I will say the whole chap is that when the trees are in close proximity to each other, what's the whole idea over here? The whole idea is that halacha l'maisa, you acquire the trees, the area, and everything situated in that area. So if there's a cedar tree there, then what? I acquired the cedar tree. I don't understand what is there to talk about. So the Gemara says, B'shusa didei nafag. So it's part of his rishus. Elahaya erez beinehen mahu. So we'll say, so rather the question is, what happens? So in other words, the Gemara thought that we were talking about a case of maybe where I sold Reuben 3 trees, and then a cedar tree sprouted in there. So maybe the shaila is who owns the cedar. So the Gemara says, if I sold it to Reuben and it grew in his domain, what's there to talk about? To which the Gemara says, no. Maybe the shaila is, what happens if I sold in the area and the cedar tree was already there? To which the Gemara says, Elahaya ar erez benehen mahu amar le kana v'kana. What's the shaila? In other words, we'll say that's still chap. When you sell 3 trees and the trees are in a minimum of Dalet Amos, maximum of 16 Amos from each other, then halacha l'maisa, I acquire the trees and I acquire everything in between them as well. And if there was a cedar tree there, then I acquire the cedar tree as well. Incredible. Good. Keitzad hein omdin. So we'll say, so now here's the interesting question. How are the trees situated, right? In this case over here. So now we'll say it's very interesting. So what we've established is that the trees have to be a minimum of 4 amas, a maximum of 16 amas. We've also established that you get the area in between, right? The area underneath and the area, a little pathway around. How are these trees arranged? How are these trees arranged? So this is fascinating. Rav Amar Kishura. Rav says, like a straight line. Actually, it's interesting. I'll say, if you look in the Rashbam has a picture. Okay, so now you know what a straight line looks like. Kishura, kazeh. It's like this. It's like this. You know, say, by the way, you ever wonder to yourself, like, why the Rashbam? Does everybody have that picture? No. Yeah, right? Oh, no? 3 dots. Just 3 dots. Right in the Rashbam. Kishura, kazeh, v'havi dalanam. So we'll say, by the way, it's interesting. It's also just, I think, a profound, like, pedagogical lesson, which is that sometimes when trying to teach something, one should not assume that someone understands something, even if it's totally pashut. Taking the extra time to go ahead and explain something can make all of the difference. Because obviously, what's simple to one person may be complex to another. So that even though, again, kind of kishura just means a line, like a line, but at the end of the day, the Rashbam says, let me show you what a line looks like. Just so that there's no ambiguity. So Rav says kishura, Shmuel Amar kechatzuva. Shmuel says like a triangle. Now, literally, chatzuva is a tripod. But it means over here a triangle. Look at the Rashbam. He also has a picture. Kechatzuva. Kan. Sheyesh lo shalosh regalim. Echad kineged avir hashtayim kazeh. It draws a triangle. So a tripod. So the say. So it's interesting because I think, I don't know, at least I've been always focusing on more like Shmuel. That is a chatzuva, that we're talking about a triangle. That always just seemed to be the most obvious way for me to visualize this whole thing. But it is interesting that Rav says, no, it's not like a triangle, but rather, again, it's like a line. Okay. Mandomer Kishura. So the opinion Rav who says that they're arranged like a line, Kol Sheken Kechatzuva. So we'll say, if you're going to say it works like a line, all the more so it works like a triangle, right? Because a triangle, why does a triangle work? Because we'll say it makes sense because in the triangle, you visualize again the area underneath the trees and the area in between the trees, right? That area is much more clearly demarcated. So that certainly works. So if you hold that a line works, like Rav, then certainly a chatzuva triangle works like Shmuel. Umandar kechatzuva, but the opinion who says that it's like a triangle, aval kishura lo. But in a line, he would hold that this halacha doesn't apply. Right, this whole halacha only works if the trees are arranged in a triangle, not if they're arranged in a line. My taima mishum de mizdara bein sayu. Ultimately, I will say because lemaisa it is difficult to access the area in between. Maskif l'Rav the mizdara bein sayu means you could plant in between them. Maskif l'Rav Hamnuna u'lemandam kechatzuva my taima delo mizdara bein sayu. The one who says like it's like a triangle, why does he say this works? Because a person wouldn't end up planting in the area in between them. When it's in a straight line, you could see yourself planting in between those areas. The triangular formation, you really wouldn't end up planting in between. Elameata zabinle tlos higi romaisa delom is darabe sayu hachenami dieshla karka. So if that's the case, if I sold someone 3 thorn bushes, 3 large thorn bushes, where it would not be common to go ahead and plant in between them. Are you telling me, therefore, that a purchase like that comes with karka? Amarle hanach lo chashivi, hanach chashivi. That's different. The 3 thorn bushes aren't chashuv, but ultimately, again, the 3 thorn bushes aren't chashuv, but ultimately, again, these are chashuv. Okay, now I'll say, so bottom line, halach l'maisa, how do we paskin? The Rambam paskin is like Shmuel, that the way this halacha 3 trees works is if it's in a triangular formation. Now, a triangle doesn't necessarily have to be like a perfect triangle. Like obviously in the Rashbam's picture over here, you get a perfect triangle. The triangle doesn't have to be perfect, but the idea over here is it applies when the trees are in some type of triangular formation and will not apply when they are in a line formation, which again makes sense. The idea over here is we're talking about a sadeh, 3 trees that become a field. When do 3 trees become a field? When they're in this triangular type formation, and therefore, again, you're getting the land underneath, the land in between, a ring around. They're a minimum of daled amas and a maximum of 16 amas away from each other. Beautiful. Now let's say Mishnah. New Mishnah. So we'll say, so now we are continuing in the halachos concerning when you buy something, what do you get along with that sale? So here we go. Hamocher rosh behema gasa. If you sell the head of a behema gasa. So we'll say, remember again, behema gasa is a large animal. It's a large animal. I would say, I just want to point out that, like, yeah, they're not for now, but all right, we'll have to come back to it. There is a tremendous amount of Musa Haskell in these Gemaras concerning trees and fields, and when is a tree versus when is a tree a field. You know, if you think about this for just a little bit, just very quickly, if you notice this idea that a tree is a singular entity. When we speak about selling 3 trees within proximity to each other, that becomes part of a chevra. That becomes part of a unit. So I will say, once there's seen a tree, and let's say a sada, a tree stands alone. But yet when a tree has proximity, it's close to other trees. But yet again, not too close. But yet not too far. Then that tree combines with other trees to be able to form a sada. It's a din in Klal Yisrael. What does it mean? You could be your own tree. You could be your own tree. You could be your own tree. But the avoda of being a Jew, the avoda of being a Yid, is being part of a sada, not just being a singular tree. So how do you become a part of Klal Yisrael? So number one, you have to be next to other trees. If you're just on your own, you're just doing your own thing. You're not part of community. You're not helping. You're not contributing. You have to be at least within Daled Amos of other trees. You have to be the kind of person who gives to other trees, the other person who supports other trees, person who loves other trees. So there has to be ultimately, again, Daled Amos of proximity. If you're more than 16 Amos away, right? If you're more than 16 Amos away, then you're on your own. You're not part of the tree. You know, I will say, but yet, what's the halacha? You can't be on top of other trees, right? If you're within an amma of another tree, too close. You know, it's one of my favorite ideas. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says that there were 10 miracles that happened in the Beis HaMikdash. And one of the miracles was, Omdim tzufufim u'mishtachavim revachim. When we stood in the Beis HaMikdash, jam-packed, right? Omdim tzufufim, mishtachavim revachim. Mishtachavim revachim means when we bowed down, prostrated, there was room for everyone. So the Rabbeinu Yonah says this is referring to Yom Kippur. That on Yom Kippur, even though there wasn't a mitzvah of Aliyah L'Reg, you don't have to go to the Beis HaMikdash on Yom Kippur, but everyone came. So they would bow down, they would prostrate themselves for vidui. So the problem is, confession. If I'm doing vidui, I'm only going to do vidui if what? If you can't hear me. Right? I'm not confessing my sins if you could hear me. So the Rabbeinu Yonah says, when they would do vidui, they would bow down, there'd be room for everyone. The Katzker, the Kehilga Katzker says something beautiful. He says, no, he says something else. He says, Omdim, if a person is always omed, always has to be right. They stand their ground on everything. It's my way or the highway. That's it. Sefufim. There's no room for anyone else. It's suffocating. Mishtachavim. You know how to bow. You're mevater. You know how to yield. You recognize that most things in life are actually not worth fighting over. So, you give in. Rabbi Nachman writes, Tov lihiyos vatron. You're mevater. Mishtachavim. Revachim. There's enough room for everyone. It's the same din in the Sada, right? There has to be at least Dalit Amos between the trees, right? Because why? I have to give your tree space, you have to give my tree space. There's enough space for all of our trees. And you could grow like you want to grow, I could grow like I want to grow. Our trees don't have to look the same, our trees don't have to grow the same, our trees don't have to do the same thing. There's enough room for all the different trees, as long as we give each other a little bit of space. Too much space. No achdus, right? Too much space, then it's not a field, then it's not a sada, then it's just a bunch of trees roaming around. So you have to be close enough that we identify together as a field, but yet a little bit of space so that each tree has the ability to grow as it needs to grow. Anyway, but I wasn't going to get into that today. So that's the Mishnah. I'll first finish up. Hamocher es harosh, hamocher rosh ve'imagasa. I'm selling the head of a large animal. Again, we'll say the shechted animal, right? So I'm selling the head. What's the halacha? Lo machras haraglayim. You don't sell the feet. Or the behema gasa is a big animal. So halacha l'maisa, again, when you sell the head, that doesn't automatically include the feet. Or the legs. Machras haraglayim, machras harosh. If you sold the legs, that doesn't include the head. Machras sakana, machras sakabit. If you sold the lungs, suppose say behema gasa means there's a lot of meat over here. If you sell the lungs, selling of the lungs doesn't include the liver. Machras sakabit, machras sakana. If you sold the liver, it doesn't include the lungs. Aval bedaka. What happens if you sell a behema daka? Behema daka is a small animal, much less meat. Machras harosh, machras haraglayim. If you sell the head, it includes the legs. Machras haraglayim, machras harosh. You sell the legs, it doesn't include the head. Machras sakana, machras sakabit. If you go ahead and you sell the lungs, you sell the liver. Machras sakabit, machras sakana. But if you sold the liver, it doesn't include the lungs. Okay, so now I want to point out over here, by the way, that Rashbam says on all of this, Hakol k'minag hamadina. The Mishnah is expressing what was common. But if you live in a place where the local customs are different, then obviously, again, Hakol k'minag hamadina. Everything goes according to local custom. So this is very interesting. Very quickly, Arba midos b'mochrin. There are 4 different types. And now, when it says Arba midos b'mochrin, literally means there's 4 different types of sales. Or really, Arba midos b'mochrin. So, for example, he says machalo chitin. Now, we'll say. Let me just say this outside. The Rashbam says, what does it mean? There are 4 different types of sales. It means, I'm not going to rush. Very rushing, right? So there are four different types of sales. Certain types of sales, the seller has the ability to void it. Certain types of sales, the buyer has the ability to void it. Certain types of sales, both parties have the ability to void. And certain types of sales, no one has the ability to void. All transactions fit into one of those 4 categories. Based on that, the Mishnah says, for example, Machalochit and Yafos Vinim Suros, I sold Ruvain wheat. It was supposed to be high quality wheat. It turned out to be inferior wheat. So what's the halacha? So in this case, the buyer has the ability to go ahead and renege on the sale. We'll say we're going to stop over here for today. We'll Amir Hashem pick up with this last part of the Mishnah tomorrow. Shkoyach, everyone. Jack, have a great day.